Hey there, welcome to the Stormwater World podcast. Shout out to our sponsor, Bloxam & Company. They have a sediment and erosion control stormwater inlet filter that's made of coconut fiber. I've known Eric Pierman and the gang over there at Bloxam for years. We've done business with them in the past, and we continue to do business with them to this day. It's a great product, and it's very simple to install. It comes in pads or rolls that you can customize to just about any stormwater drain, and it's very, very simple to maintain as well. You get a great visual when driving your site because you don't have to stop and look down into the drain. You can literally just put this product over the top of the drain inlet, and then you're going to see the sediment on top of it. After a rain event, you can have someone sweep it off and get prepared for the next event. They also offer a free sample, so make sure to check them out. You can go to bloxam.com, that's BLOCKSOM.com, or you can contact them at 219-363-0206, or shoot Eric an email at eric.pierman, that's PEARMAN, at bloxam.com. He can answer any of your questions you may have, as well as let you know where the closest distributor is in your area. Thanks. Let's get back to the episode.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to a new episode of the Stormwater World podcast. With me today is Caleb Rennaker. He is IDEM's, which is the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, Watershed Planning and Restoration Section Chief. He is also a watershed and water quality professional with experience leading Clean Water Act programs focused on non-point source pollution, TMDLs, impaired waters, watershed planning, monitoring, and restoration implementation. His work centers on helping connect environmental data, local partnerships, funding, and public communication to meaningful water quality outcomes. Caleb is especially interested in making complex water issues easier to understand and helping communities see how everyday land use decisions connect to downstream water quality. That was a lot. Caleb, welcome to the podcast. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I have to apologize right out of the gate. I did not make it to your presentation at the Indiana MS4 annual meeting, but I heard about it. And so then I saw you on LinkedIn, reached out, and here we are today. So I'm really excited. No pressure, but you are our first regulator, if you will, to be able to make it on the podcast. So I'm happy to have you on. And I know that you've got a couple of key points that you want to touch on today, but I want to start with, because I talk about it ad nauseum on this podcast, about how can we flip the script and quit talking to each other about stormwater and really get it out there to the public. And that was one of your talking points. So I want to get your feel on public education and getting it, just the stormwater word out to the general public.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important topic, especially in the stormwater world, because in my world, I'm not just in the regulated world. I work in total maximum daily loads, which ties into the NPDES permitting and things that people have to do. But my world's really non-point source pollution, which is maybe 70 to 80% of water bodies are impacted by non-point source pollution, and we kind of dial into what's coming out of the end of the pipe. But in reality, kind of the collective actions that we all do as just the normal layperson really adds up and has a lot of impact across the board. So I think the public communication standpoint of it is super critical, because I don't think people understand although we have a lot of regulatory tools over, pollution coming into our water bodies, a lot of it is voluntary practices that need to happen to people. So that communication side of it's extremely important to try to get that message out. And it's difficult because these topics aren't always the most exciting and riveting topics to tell people, right? They get exciting to us. It's easy for me to geek out to it and be excited about it. But to the general public, it gets really technical and really complicated and easily just, you see people's kind of eyes glaze over on things. So something I've kind of started doing the last year and a half, especially with some tools. I've always been at least enough of a creative person with, messaging and ideas, but I'm not a graphic type of person. So I've been able to kind of use some tools to be able to help make graphics and things like that I normally wouldn't be able to. And that's really opened up a lot of doors, and it's been a lot of fun because it can help kind of get those messages out. I found like analogies really resonate with people when they can connect this work to the things that they're doing and understand in their day-to-day lives that make sense to it. So it's trying to take that technical, complex information, dilute it down to something that is meaningful to everybody's, daily lives, so that they can understand why that concept matters or whatever. Because it's super important, super challenging to get people to understand the topics like we do. And when we're dealing with this every single day, that jargon, that technical language becomes, everyday language for us in state government and everything else. To live in a world of acronyms, I could tell you an entire paragraph just using acronyms, right? And somehow somebody else will understand it that I'm talking to, but the public gets lost on that like immediately. So, I think we've got a lot more tools and a lot more options at our disposal, even because we're really trained to be technical communicators, and a lot of the field that we're in. We're not trained to be great people communicators, and there's a disconnect there. So there's a real need for us to like expand our skills into being people communicators and getting that, because we're not going to solve the challenges that we have today by just trying to attack the problems in our little micro programs that are often, understaffed, under-resourced, and things like that. We really need the buy-in from the public and to get them to understand and to appreciate the need for these things. So, communication is extremely important.
Are you involved with any of the educational outreaches through IDEM, or do you work with enough MS4s to where you would know somebody that's doing some good work to where you could share some ideas with the audience, or is that really just not your world?
It is and it isn't. Our media has done better over the past few years of putting stuff out there for the public. I think it's been always really helpful. I mean, it's hard from the regulatory stance of, to always maintain our neutrality and things like that, and make sure we're pushing out the facts on those things, which, normally this stuff's not always that fully contentious or whatever. We do have a lot of the projects. My program passes money through federal funds for local watershed planning projects. So as part of every one of those projects, there's an educational outreach component to it. And there's a lot of, great ideas that come from each one of those projects. But something we're trying to do in the past year or so is dig some of that stuff up. We probably got 20 years worth of like projects like that. And every one of these local projects is doing their own kind of education outreach activities. And there's a lot of great ideas from some people more creative than others are doing a way better job. And I feel like it kind of goes into a final report and then goes into a file, right? So that's something we've even had our staff looking at, is digging some of that stuff up so that we can provide, better real world examples and materials that these groups have published over time, and like say, hey, we think this is the really good stuff. We need to make sure that like all of our groups that are working with us on projects are seeing this information. So we do dabble in, the education outreach world always as part of these projects. I wouldn't say that it's as much part of my realm. I guess I start getting in my role a little bit more disconnected from that. I end up in the, sticking to my computer in the administrative day to day, making sure that the grant funding's coming through and all of that stuff, rather than, getting to really put my hands on like the education outreach stuff on that side of things. But there's a lot of work going on across the space. I don't have any, great specific examples that's coming to me off the top of my head. Some of my other staff probably would have better things to say.
Well, I just looking at y'all's website. It looks like you guys definitely are embracing social media. So that's good. And it's just got to be hard, right? No, people just don't, they care about stormwater when it's in their house. That's what I tell everybody. Like all the other nuances that wrap around our industry is just, it's very difficult, like you're saying, to package it up in a digestible way for the average person to care about. right, to where they want to help make that difference. But kudos to you guys for doing what you're doing to try to help the municipalities. So let's switch over and talk about those guys and gals. I think we had on here one of the other points that we wanted to talk about, MS4s and the future of non-point source pollution. It says, yeah, we have in the show notes, MS4 programs are one of the most practical frameworks we have for addressing water quality impacts from urban and suburban runoff. They're more than permit requirements. They can help connect local planning, public education, infrastructure, partnerships, and measurable water quality outcomes. You kind of want to unpack your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So it's something I've been thinking about lately. And, you know, when you look at like non-point source pollution in general, we think about urbanization and how it's changing the landscape. And I think the viewpoint of that just inherently seems like, negative, I guess, is, like the front, hey, we've got this urbanization, we've got these bigger stormwater problems. But, in reality, a lot of the land uses aren't pristine across the board. It's not always the case, but in some ways you're converting urban areas from agricultural areas. And those agricultural areas, depending on how those are managed, aren't necessarily, they're not mature forested areas that are, pristine for reducing non-point source pollution into waterways already themselves. And, what's interesting about those is that the non-point source world is highly unregulated, right? There's a few states that are able to kind of regulate some of it, but across the board, non-point source is just not explicitly regulated in the way that, these point source permitted entities are. So there's actually a really interesting opportunity there when we look at urbanization. That land use is one of the things that's definitely expanding more and more. And, it kind of, so to speak, gobbles up some of these other surrounding land uses. There is an opportunity there. It's a challenge for urbanization with stormwater, but there's the opportunity because once that kind of runs into an MS4 or a regulated stormwater entity, you get some regulated controls over it. So, I'm not sitting here just advocating for like regulation on one thing or another. I'm just saying, it's an observation and an opportunity for us to like really think about how important those programs are and how those programs are being developed and changed over time, because they're becoming an even more important mechanism than they even have been, right? Because they're expanding, and the more that area expands, there's more issues that need to be addressed there. So, and once we, like I said, once we kind of hit into that regulatory realm, then we do have some more, easily meaningful controls, because that non-point source, it's really based on a lot of voluntary practices and things like that, which can be very challenging to get people to do, especially when they don't have to do it and there's no money involved there and those sort of things. So, I think it's a world we definitely need to be paying attention to, and knowing that how those programs are formed are going to potentially have way more of an impact as we continue to have more urbanization and land use changes across the board, than maybe we even realize now.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned just now talking about like I'm not you're not advocating more regulations or whatever, and I think it's important just to point out that for this episode, so people don't come at me in the comments, to be quite honest, like this is an opportunity to understand that you have a resource in IDEM. You have a friend in Caleb, and that you can use them as an asset to help you understand your program and to understand it, beyond the things that you are required to do. And I'm definitely not advocating, like, I get it, we're all overworked and we're under budgeted and whatnot, but I did not put this out for a poll. Like, hey, what do you want me to ask Caleb on this podcast? That is not what this episode's about. So if you thought that's what it was, then you were mistaken. My goal here was to showcase the fact that he was willing to come and speak at the Indiana conference and did a fantastic job. Like I said, from what I heard, we were running around doing videos and whatnot. We didn't get a chance to listen to your presentation, but I want people to understand that there's a resource that they can reach out to, and that you're an asset to help and assist them. Which kind of leads us into our next point that you kind of wanted to talk about, which is how stormwater is one. It's just a fast, it's more than just the NPDES program, right? And so I'll kind of read what you put here in our notes, was that stormwater is not only a permit issue, it is also a water quality issue tied to the uses we are trying to protect, including aquatic life, recreation, drinking water, and downstream community uses. I think there's value in discussing how stormwater fits into the larger Clean Water Act picture, especially through standards, improvements, TMDLs, and watershed-based planning. So you want to go ahead and take it from there on that thought?
Yeah. So it kind of ties in what I was speaking earlier, but I think it's easy, especially when you're tasked with this role of, overseeing your stormwater programs, your MS4, you're really in the mindset of your permit, right? I mean, that's what you're trying to make sure that you're in compliance and things like that. So it's easy to kind of look at that role and say, hey, this is just a permitting thing. We're trying to meet these goals, check these boxes, those sort of things. But in reality, like, the downstream impacts of stormwater are huge when you kind of zoom out and try to look at the whole picture. So in my world, I'm looking at, larger scale watersheds. My group's really looking at watershed planning and ultimately implementation to, once we see there's water quality problems, to clean those things up. One of the partnerships, and some of our groups are good about it, of when they form a watershed group and they have money to develop a plan and to implement a plan, there's all these different stakeholders in the room. Everybody that touches water can be a stakeholder in these water quality improvement projects, right? But there's those big opportunities with source water protection and our stormwater regulated entities. We look at non-point source, and it's kind of that, hey, we're really after the voluntary practices. So in Indiana, it's a big agricultural state. We spend a lot of our funds through to agricultural best management practices and things like that. We've got a lot of rural watersheds in the state. So a lot of the projects we're doing aren't even in a kind of an MS4 area. But I think because of the way the programs evolved into that, these projects, people kind of follow through from the last project or whatever as examples and that sort of things. We end up having a lot of those agricultural based projects, and there's nothing wrong with that on there. But the urban side is something I'm kind of trying to explore a little bit more in recent times, because there's big opportunities there for those partnerships, and to make sure that when a watershed group's coming in and starting this group and inviting stakeholders to participate in those discussions and be part of that plan, because in your watershed, an MS4 might be smack dab right on top in that watershed. So you've got this huge urban area. Well, if you look at that and say, hey, that's the MS4 area that's regulated, they're doing their thing, we're going to go over here in the watershed and work on these things. That's not necessarily inherently bad, but it's kind of really missing out on a big opportunity to be partnerships with those MS4s. So because we can still pass through money to some of those areas in MS4s and do practices in those urban areas. So where we get limited with our 319 program is what we're in with funds from the Clean Water Act 319. We can't help entities meet their permit with our money. Like if it's a permit requirement, we can't pass through that federal money to then, allow them to help meet that permit requirement. But we can do above and beyond things to that. So I think a lot of people get in the mindset that, oh, that's the regulated entity, we can't help them get their permit. There's nothing that we can really do in that area. And urban areas also get complicated to work in with additional regulation, permitting, stuff like that from just doing projects, right? Not just the NPDES side, but actually constructing things and doing things like, green infrastructure practices. So it's additionally challenging in there, but that's where, getting those people that are working in those municipality areas or whatever that are in those programs and can make the connections, internally within their own municipalities and know where to go are huge partners, because once you kind of get them in the room, I think that makes the conversation a little easier, because all of a sudden you kind of got some people, in that area that can help make those projects happen. So it's very daunting to look at a whole watershed scale project and be like, oh, we need to fix everything, right? There's so many sources and so many things you can look at, and you can't tackle it all at once. So, those partnerships are really important. So I think it's good for, people in those MS4 entities in the stormwater world that's regulated to not just think about themselves in that regulated world, but try to look for other opportunities of hey, there are other watershed planning processes going on. And the same thing for our watershed groups, to make sure that they're talking about those things and not just seeing stormwater as a point source thing. Because that's the other side of the good part of voluntary. I talked about, the opportunities, right, with expanding regulation in MS4 areas and the changing land use. But voluntary has a lot of power in itself that's not regulated, because there's a lot of leeway that can kind of happen there without, the bureaucratic red tape on things that just kind of naturally comes with regulation. So there's a lot of great work and opportunities there. People are willing to kind of have those partnerships and explore those things.
So a couple of thoughts on that. One is, from what I'm hearing you say, is don't isolate yourself, right? Yeah. Because the water certainly doesn't care. It's going to flow from your MS4 out your MS4 or your incorporated area down the water. It's just going to go where it wants to. So don't isolate yourself and look to play nice with others. But something that I'd like to talk about in a little bit more detail, because I've never had anybody on that could probably unpack it as well as you, is just the 319 grant program. Is that kind of like the beginning of how you create these watershed groups? Is that how? So funding mechanism? You want to talk about that, because I think that's pretty important, because that actually extends outside of Indiana, so that would be cool, right?
Yeah. So this is a national program. It's from the Clean Water Act, Section 319. Right. So this is the non-point source programming, basically. So we're under US code, right? That every state needs to have a strategy for managing non-point source pollution. And then the 319 program in the Clean Water Act is kind of that primary mechanism for kind of addressing non-point source pollution. So the way it effectively works is every state comes up with they develop a statewide non-point source management plan that they work with EPA on, that's going to outline their priorities and what they're going to kind of, how they're identifying, their big priority areas and priority pollutants for the state, and how they're going to basically address those problems. And then it's kind of a calculated grant amount that each state gets, depending on a lot of various factors. So every year we're getting a lump of money that's passed through from EPA to us, and every state can kind of do it differently. So not every state is going to use this money in the exact same way, but in a nutshell, the money has to be used for work that's going to reduce non-point source pollution that improves water quality. So, they have EPA has some guidance and kind of how that money can be used and things like that. But honestly, in reality, it's a fairly open-ended, if you can make that justification and make that case, and it can't be used to help permits, and there's some things like that. But it's a decently open enough pot of money that states can kind of choose how they're going to prioritize and use that. So the way that Indiana uses it is we get that funding, a piece of that funding then goes to overhead to pay for our administration, our administrative duties as a state, and salaries and stuff for our technical staff that's going to help administer the program. But then we really try to pass as much of that money off as possible to local groups. So we'll have local entities that will apply for this money every year to do either watershed planning projects, where they'll spend a few years in developing a watershed management plan for their area. And then once they have a watershed management plan that kind of meets those, what EPA calls, 9 key elements that's in these plans that they say is deemed like, the essential elements that you need to write in this plan. Then once they have that plan, that opens up the option for them to apply for money for implementation dollars. And that basically just means putting practices on the ground to actually, fix water quality challenges. So most of the groups that we're working with are doing this through kind of a cost share program where they're finding, producers, landowners, entities that want to install these best management practices, and then that entity is, footing, about 25% of the cost, and then they're paying for the other percentage of the cost on it. So we're kind of putting that on the local level. Every states kind of do that differently, with maybe they're the ones writing the plans or, doing different parts of that. So we're part of approving those plans, but we really pass that down to our local levels. We want to have our local entities write those plans and they know the area best, and they know what's happening in there. They know their partnerships. So they create those partnerships, get these groups together, and, we're helping pay for that. And some of the ideas behind that is it's a little bit of like complementary money to other programs that are happening, or seed money. So in the case of like agricultural producers, some of that can be risky for them to try to start a new practice that they haven't done before, right? And that's their livelihood, right? So, that's important, right? You don't want to, even 1 year of, hey, we screwed up is a big deal for them, right? So
right.
When you're trying to sell these things, we care about water quality, but, there's not everybody cares about water quality from the same bottom line that we do. So you try to find those other solutions or things that they're at, like, hey, this is good. This improves soil health, right? So this is going to ultimately, these practices could increase your yield over time, and those sort of things. So, if we can find those win-win solutions, that's always really a lot easier, because you're trying to sell it to the person that really wants, everybody has their own bottom line or whatever on things. So, we have to, it goes back to the communication things. It's just kind of figuring out what's important to people, and how do we kind of see our water quality improvements while not, allowing a more accessible mechanism and allowing people to try some of these things without it all being on their own bottom line.
Right. So, and I don't know the rules. I don't know what you're allowed to talk about or not talk about, but do you have any examples of any cool projects that are around that to give to the listeners? Or they just, is there any projects that you've been a part of or that you've seen?
Yeah. So I'll give you a more kind of statewide answer, I guess, on that. But we have at any point in time about 50 to 60 projects happening across the state. And they're probably, average of 3 to 4 year long projects. So we do have a lot of good examples on that. And the best way to see true examples of that is to look up our non-point source success stories. So these are on EPA's website. If you look up EPA non-point source success stories, then they've got a cool map on there that you can look at the different states, and that outlines what states have submitted to EPA as success stories. So these aren't mandatory. The states all submit these to EPA on the current metrics, but that's kind of our only national metric for the 319 program. So that outlines, they're kind of these short little write-ups of kind of the funding that went into the projects, the partners that went in, any story highlights, implementation practices that were installed. And we see water quality, where it was originally. And then, after there was a lot of work done on these projects, and then where it ultimately landed. So most of these stories are where we knew that there was water quality issues of waters that were impaired and listed on our 303D list of impaired waters, formally impaired. And then we had these non-point source related projects that happened. And often this is not always a quick fix. A lot of these projects are over 10, 20 year periods of people doing multiple rounds of implementation and work in these watersheds. And then we go back. We have a program that kind of specifically targets and looks for these things where we know that there was a lot of practices happening. And we go back there, do follow-up monitoring. And hopefully if we see changes and it's now meeting our water quality criteria or our standards, then we can, have that delisted from our impaired waters list. So once that happens, we can, basically deem this a non-point source success story for the state. And we can write that up. We send it to EPA. EPA kind of reviews and make sure it kind of hits their criteria for what a success story is. And then they publish it on our website. So we'd been doing really well about actually finding stories and not so great about documenting all of the stories just because it takes time, right? You got to have somebody to do it. So one of the things we really wanted to do over the last few years is just, we're like, hey, this is really important. Like everybody's always looking for, is this worth it? Or, the money, the millions of dollars that's ultimately being spent on this, is it having an impact? Is it changing things? Well, I think internally we really do kind of know these things, and we know, the science kind of behind it and that it is working, but it's really important to actually, document those things formally to show like, hey, yeah, it truly is having an impact there. So we made a big push last year in 2025 to say, hey, we've got this like pile of stories that we have in the hopper that we haven't pitched out there. And it's not only important for us, but important for our partners, because they may not even always have a mechanism for showing success in their own programs. So it's not just us. We partner with like, USDA, National Resource Conservation Service money. There's state Clean Water Indiana funding and projects that go into this, and everybody kind of vies for their own, justifying their existence, right? Of this money's going to good use. So we think these are a great way to highlight those things, and we have a mechanism. So we kind of thought, hey, this is big. We should put this onus on us to really make sure that we are submitting those stories and telling those things, not only for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all of our partners, and also to showcase that, yes, these projects do actually, lead to notable improvements over time. So we pushed out like 13 stories last year, which was the most of any other state in 2025, where we don't have the most success stories in the country. But we were pretty proud of just being able to like pitch out that many stories last year, and shows that there was a lot of great work happening across the state. And hopefully that's really encouraging for people that work in this sector, because it can be long and arduous and tough to just sit there and think that this is not making a difference over time. But, in reality, you can kind of look at those stories and see, hey, this happened over 15 years. So like maybe the work that somebody did for just a few years there, helping move the needle on that, may not have seemed, overwhelmingly important to them at the time, but it really did feed into the overall progress that was seen over those years.
I mean, it's full circle. Yeah, look, right? Like, so yeah. I don't know if those stories are on your all's Facebook, but they should be, because, we're talking about public education and community involvement and how do we do it. And like people, they want to be proud of their state, and facts tell and stories sell, right? So the more stories you can tell them, and the more that you can show them that it worked and the money was like, look at this, and the money was well spent,
yeah.
and it moved the needle. And even sometimes if it didn't, necessarily move the needle right away, but it's just, people like, especially, I grew up in Indiana, so fishing and going to, different water bodies where, I live in Texas, not too far away from, the ocean at this point. But in Indiana, it's all about, every little creek and stream and catching frogs and all the weird things we did as kids. Yeah. And that is completely undocumented, thank God. As a Gen Xer, but I'm saying that water was a big deal, growing up in that state and there in Indiana. And so, I hope you guys are taking those stories and actually pushing them through all your channels, out to the public. But I'm on here on the EPA site, and we'll link this for folks. My actual initial reaction was, again, I think people isolate themselves sometimes and they're freaking out and trying to, slay the dragon by themselves on their programs. And there's a lot of resources out there. And so maybe one of these success stories can give them an aha moment and say, oh, cool, we should probably try to chase that money down and do that in our own watershed. I took you away a little bit and we went down that. I definitely wanted to have that. I think, of our listeners, I think a lot of times we do have a lot of new people in the industry. And so I like to break down the acronyms and break down what's available to them and break down the different programs. But I did take you away from what you were talking about. Do you want to go back and did we miss anything on kind of that 30,000 foot view that you are tasked with of tackling these watersheds with all of the different moving parts that go into that?
No, I just think it's important to continue to look for those opportunities, and as you said, don't try to slay the dragon by yourself. I don't remember the report, but there was one of the basically like the needs for water quality, right, like across the country, and I think for Indiana, like just for I think tying to some of the like non-point source and agricultural stuff. I don't remember how many like billions of dollars it was that we really needed like right now. And when I look at, the funding that we have just with our 319 program, we get a few million a year, right, that's coming into that for our state. And it sounds like a lot of money until you're trying to tackle, statewide issues and things like that. So I think at one point I looked at it and it was like how many like 500 years of our funding, to like tackle this problem. So like, it was really eye-opening of like this, this is like a non-point source program, but like we cannot do it like by just slaying that dragon by ourselves, right? Like you really do have to be creative about how to make that money go furthest that you can and have the impact that you can and not just operate in a vacuum and try to, take on the world by yourself because you simply, it's too big of a problem to take on by yourself to do these things. It really does kind of take that. You got to look up, from the clouds and kind of look at this whole thing and look what you're potentially missing there and look for opportunities. Coordination between programs is huge. And I think, we've gotten better about that even internally. So I work with our total maximum daily load program. I don't know how familiar you are with those, but we used to not really work that well with our NPDES group of talking to them as much as we really should be. And there's a lot of opportunities there, especially when we start looking at like nutrients and things like that come from treatment plants. And, it's a big problem and it's hard because it's expensive for treatment, to do these things. So you're just trying to find practical solutions. And really there's a lot of other solutions when you kind of start looking at that big picture, and you can get a lot more creative with it. So I think a lot of programs are doing better about that. It kind of varies from state to state. Sometimes it's just organizational structure of how things are. But the more we can make sure that other programs know what programs are doing, how they can fit in, because I don't think you kind of just roll with what's happened or how these programs have been developed over time. And in reality, there's a lot of different ways these programs can tie into each other and help each other. So, not only internally for like regulatory programs and stuff like IDEM, but how can these other entities start thinking about partnerships that they really haven't thought about before? And that's where some of that, water cooler talk, right? Start talking to people and come up with ideas and be like, hey, you do that. Can we do that? And like help with these things. I think there's a lot of opportunities that are untapped out there still.
Well, did you want to talk a little bit more in detail about the TMDL, the total maximum daily load? Like you want to just kind of explain how that program works in a little bit more detail? I mean, I've got the time. If you've got the time, I think it's important.
So, it's total maximum daily load program, or, refer to it as TMDL. It's an analysis and report. It's a requirement in the Clean Water Act of basically once there's an impaired water on the impaired waters list on the 303D list, that it's, for most waters, it's required that there be a TMDL produced. And that's effectively just the amount of pollutant, calculation of how much pollutant can be in a water body, in a daily time period and still meet our water quality criteria or our water quality standards. So that one kind of is more of the regulatory and non-regulatory tools and ways, because we can incorporate point source and non-point source into that calculation. So we're effectively calculating at like a watershed scale how many pounds of a pollutant can be in that watershed and kind of still meet those water quality criteria. So it's whatever we put in the TMDL for point source has to be consistent with NPDES permitting. So if we put in a TMDL, you can't be less stringent in a permit sort of situation. So they do have regulatory ties, but the way that the NPDES program has worked, a lot of times we're incorporating existing permit limits into our TMDLs. That's not always the case, but they can change permit limits. But you're doing with a TMDL of you're trying to look at where are we currently at in our water quality and how much reductions do we need in order to like meet that criteria. So like where, and then you start looking into sources and saying, where can we get those reductions in practice? So it can impact, permitting things, but our program uses a lot of the non-point source side of implementing. So that's kind of the main mechanism that we're kind of trying to get those load reductions from our TMDLs. But it does play into the stormwater world, because anybody with an NPDES permit, is on the hook involved in a TMDL. So I'm not sure nationally across the board how every state handles, those stormwater permits and things in their TMDLs, where stormwater is a little bit of a wild beast and it's hard to estimate. There's some modeling and things like that. Some of those tools become pretty technically complicated if you have the people that know how to run those things and give those exact answers. But sometimes you just have to find some more simpler solutions. So kind of based on like a land-based area of like what contribution is, attributed to that MS4 area. And it's more straightforward, like I said, in the an outfall that specifically you can measure really easily what that's coming from. There's the treatment process involved. It's just easier to kind of dial in. The stormwater side is really, there's a lot of different outfalls and conveyances to like a stormwater system. You're trying to figure those things out. So I think in our case, a lot of it ties into like, we give an allocation for like how many pounds of sediment or whatever that this MS4, is estimated to contribute and what they need to be contributing. But it's not as much just directly incorporate that number into their permit and say, good luck figuring it out. It's more like, hey, follow your MS4 permit, and the best management practices and your minimum control measures and things like that you need to do. I'm not sure, I won't speak for our stormwater program specifically. There may be some additional requirements as part of the MS4 permit if they're in an area that's been, if they're being included in a TMDL or not. So it does implicate some things on there, but
I almost wonder if that's like I don't know if you'd be willing to come back, and I almost feel like that's a whole separate conversation on TMDLs. Like, so what do I mean? Like, you mentioned the outfall thing. Okay, I've made it very clear on this podcast that I'm not the brightest, tool in the shed, and which is helpful. I feel like to our listeners, but I really kind of boiled it down in my brain. But I'm not a field guy. I was a software guy, and so for years I sold compliance software for MS4s, right? But I was never really a field guy. I was just taking their feedback, and we were developing the software around the needs out in the field, as well as for the entire MS4 program, right? But I'm thinking, on the outfall thing, that makes total sense to me, right? Because I could, like, if there's something coming out of the outfall and it's not raining, that's probably not, something's going on there, right? Other than just maybe dew or whatever is going on. But I can catch that water and then I can chase it up the pipe, right? That makes total sense to me. What gets hard on the TMDL that I've never really, like, I don't know how you guys do it. And again, this may be one of those things where you're like, bro, I got to come back, is when you've got a moving body of water and we take a sample, and we're able to extrapolate all this data on one sample at one time at one You know what I'm saying? Like, how does that work? And then how do you bring it back out? Like you said, on a watershed basis, um, and not only just, and then you got to look at the map and then figure out, okay, well, if we do have this concentration, like, do you just make, is there assumptions made? Like, if it's really high concentrated on this one day, on this one test, or am I crazy on how it's tested? And it's tested over a long period of time with water running through some sort of thing. Like, can you just kind of clean me up on just the basics? And maybe that is a whole conversation that should be had
Yeah, and I'll fully
under.
admit I'm not my field experience is in like aquatic biology sampling and stuff in streams, right?
Okay.
So I'm
Yeah.
not a
Okay.
stormwater field guy either for my training of
Yeah.
what's happening on there. But I can tell you, I can speak to how we look at it from the TMDL side. And again, like
Right.
some
Right.
other
Right.
states can do it differently. If you got some modeling and stuff like that, that can really help dial some of that stuff in. If you got the people that know how to do that, we dabble in the modeling, but there's only a few of us really in the state that are doing TMDLs. So, it's we try to find some simpler solutions, and it's really only been a little over a decade or so ago before like the stormwater specific NPDES permits were like kind of pushed by EPA to be more in the TMDLs, like kind of, and then it's like, well, how do we fully estimate that, right? Because it's coming off everywhere. So one of the solutions, that we've used is, you figure out your contributions from your point sources, and then you have your contributions that's from the land, from the runoff or whatever. You're kind of calculating that area, that volume of water that's ultimately in that watershed area, and how many pounds can be in there. So you kind of say, hey, it's non-point source, but it's not non-point source, right? It's runoff from stormwater, which behaves like non-point source, but it's obviously it's regulated under an NPDES stormwater permit, so there's regulation behind it. So we kind of look at it as, hey, here's the land use, here's the land area that the MS4 area is within this watershed, and say, hey, this is our allocation in this TMDL that's attributed to non-point source, or like anything that's not the point source, and say, hey, you're going to get like a percentage of that, because we're basically saying that the water that's running off of your area is part of that overall load allocation. And then that's where it gets tricky of implementing like that specific number, right? And that's kind of why it's not always like universally just enforced as like, hey, you have to hit this number, because it's the estimation process of it is already a little ambiguous and challenging. And EPA even recognizes that in some of their guidance, that it's estimating the stormwater contribution is complicated, or there's a lot of nuances there. So that's why it's really implemented more through those best management practices and things like that. But that's something we tried to look at. There were conversations a few years back in our program, and honestly, we haven't had a project in one of our TMDLs that's hit an MS4 since like 2020, which is strange, but we've just been kind of in these rural watershed projects or whatever for the last few years. But we've got some projects now in MS4 areas that we're looking at, and we're kind of revitalizing some of that conversation, because that has been conversation of the years of, you're in a TMDL, then what does that really mean? And I think historically it has been a little bit of a checkbox. You acknowledge that you're in a TMDL for a permit and things like that. And the programs have evolved to what that really means and what you need to do as part of that. But it's something our TMDL program is trying to do a little bit better on, is trying to give some of that feedback of, here's some things you can do. We're not necessarily going to make it a prescriptive requirement in the TMDL or something that's necessarily going to be transferred directly into your permit, but here's how we can help you, similar to what we would do with a non-point source, watershed group that's just trying to address non-point sources, the same things. Just, hey, this is in an urban area. What are tools? What are things that are, how can we be a technical resource to helping that? Because we're spending the time to come up with this holistic plan. So what are better things that we can put in there, rather than, hey, we estimated some land-based area number because we had to, and we get our cookie, we get it approved, and we move on. We're really trying to make these things useful, because historically in the TMDL program, there was a lot of TMDLs that got shelved. Basically, there was an era of states, not doing TMDLs because it's like it took a while to really ramp up. They put it in the Clean Water Act. It took a while for these programs to really ramp up. And what does this mean? Right. How do we make TMDLs? And they we call it the kind of the consent decree era, where there was a lot of lawsuits over states not doing TMDLs. So states basically got sued and said, hey, you have to do TMDLs. Well, the solution at the time was like, hey, you have to do this many TMDLs per year. Which is fine, you get numbers done, but it started becoming a game of states chasing numbers rather than chasing impact.
See, yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
The things that we can get, right? So,
yeah.
Then, EPA kind of saw that, and there's been some pivoting over the last decade of really like a long-term vision process. So identifying those most critical areas, those areas where we're likely to have implementation happening and things like that. Because we were creating a lot of TMDLs and then it just got put on a shelf, right? So it's great. You have this great plan, but without anybody on the ground to do things, and then by the time somebody wants to do something with it, it's, hey, that was 15 years ago. It's old. It's not helpful. So really our program's trying to really want to make sure that these TMDLs are getting implemented. So we're actually working with watershed groups from the front end when we pick projects. We're specifically trying to find areas where we're doing TMDLs because we have plenty of areas of TMDLs to do across the state and only a few people. So we've got plenty of work to do with TMDLs. So we're trying to really find groups that we know are going to want to take this TMDL, help use that TMDL to then fill in the pieces on what they would need for a watershed management plan, and then go into implementation, what's really cool is that our TMDL and 319 programs are under the same umbrella because we can kind of do that with our funding mechanisms and things like that to kind of streamline that process and make it work. Because implementable TMDLs are really just the kind of the gold standard Cadillac for us of being able to say, hey, there's now people that are going to take this thing and do things with it or whatever. So,
and then what happens
on a little bit of a tangent there, but hopefully that answered it.
I find this very this is intriguing to me because if I was out there, that would be my life's goal, right? If I was responsible for any little section, I don't care what kind of permit, but you're responsible for this, and where the rubber meets the road for me is that water body right there. Can I drink it? Can I test it? Is it, what's the baseline? And then, okay, this is the baseline, good, bad, or ugly. Can I make it better? That's where the rubber makes, to me, and very simple. Here's the baseline of what this water is. Can I make it better? I do that in my house, right? We do that in our house. That's why we have water filters on our fridge, because the water comes in. It's good. It's exactly. You can drink it out of the tap, but that's the baseline water, and I want to make it better. So I'm going to put this filter on there. So I know I'm being really, really simplistic right now, but in my mind, that's the goal, right? That's what we're doing. And so when you're able to find these folks and you get it established, then what happens next? And they're just reporting back to you guys the data is at that point, and you're able to collect the data on it to see the improvement, or did I get lost in that a little bit?
No, you're good. So, a lot of those, a lot of our projects, when we're passing that money off, if they're doing a planning project, they'll usually do some monitoring up front to kind of characterize, the water quality in their own area or whatever, so that they can set goals, right, and track that in the long term. But then, they report back any best management practices that are installed. With this funding, that gets reported back to us, and we make sure it's all eligible expenses or whatever the things. And then there's tools that we get that we can calculate theoretical load reductions from those practices, so we can kind of see hey, this practice was put in on this many acres. It should have reduced you down this many pounds of sediment or this many pounds of phosphorus for annually, as long as that practice is installed. So all of those watershed plans have shorter term goals, and then up to 30-year long goals, of getting those reductions, and they're kind of, reporting on those practices. And then a lot of them will do some level of some follow-up monitoring, right, to then see, those levels of improvements or whatever. But then that's where our performance monitoring programs kind of also come into play, and we see that there's been a lot of work done in there, and we'll go back and do some monitoring. But in a perfect world, we'd always give a lot of money for monitoring, but monitoring's expensive and resource intensive. So after that, during that implementation phase, we don't always give a lot of funding for continuous monitoring on there, just because we're trying to be strategic as possible in making that money stretch, and we've already let them, hey, you sampled up front, there's some issues, like do your thing for a while, and then we'll talk about some follow-up monitoring to see if it's getting better, because we know it's not going to instantly get better in most cases. It's going to take a while.
Now you also have in here about environmental data. And so does that lead into all the data collection? Is that part of what your team does? Is on the big big data
in
side?
some ways, that was a little bit more of my previous role working with that stuff. But we get the branch that I'm in. We're responsible for water monitoring throughout the entire state. So it kind of works out because we're kind of a full circle group where we've got our team of people that do, monitoring and assessments to make sure if it's meeting our criteria and, what goes on our impaired waters list. And then my group's kind of the cleanup crew, right? Of the planning and cleanup crew of how do we actually implement and fix those things. So we deal with a lot of our water quality data across the state. But, we'll say that's always a good opportunity because we collect kind of our authoritative data. And since we're making regulatory decisions on it, it needs to meet certain QA, QC standards kind of thing. But trying to make sure that people have access to that data is always, we've gotten better about that over the years, especially with like GIS story maps, interactive tools and that sort of thing. Like we've built some tools to make it easier to find what we're doing and see what we're doing. Cause that's a hard one with, even permitted facilities and stuff like that, like needing to know that information when they're applying. And it's funny because I helped build a tool a number of years ago that shows where our watershed plans are and our TMDLs are in the state compared to like where some of the impairments are, as a public facing tool that people could zoom in, click, see what's out there. And, at one point I was told a consultant had told somebody else that I work with that if they have to find that information, like when they're applying for a permit where a TMDL is, they were going to have to pay a consultant like $10,000 to find this information. And I'm like, oh man, I'm in the wrong industry because I just pushed this map out to the state for free. I should have held on to my information, but we've tried to do a lot better about putting that information out there for the public, and then it's kind of a communication things. But that's also another great opportunity for our other regulated communities and anybody that's collecting data. There's other people that are collecting data for various reasons out there, and we're trying to do more about getting those people to like share that data with us. I understand sometimes people are wary to share the data or whatever, but we're doing more evaluations on some of that data, encouraging people if they have that data and they're willing to share with us, like we can evaluate it to see that if it meets the standards that it needs to meet to be higher authority data with like proper QA QC type of stuff to it. But if they can share that to us and it meets those thresholds, we can actually use that to inform like our impaired waters and stuff across the state. So that's where it's good for make the shout out on that for our external data framework for people. If they have data in the state or whatever, and they want to I definitely reach out to us. We'd love to work with you to try to use that data. And we have for the first time in the last past year started using data that was submitted to us externally, and we were able to review it and use it in assessment. So it's pretty cool because data is expensive and time consuming to get, and there's a lot of good data out there, and it doesn't just need to be the data that the IDEM collects. It kind of takes a village here, so I'd love to use it. So I'll make that plug for sharing data externally. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. And I think, hey, I know. I promised you. So I promise. Caleb, I was like, oh yeah, we're gonna record for like 30 minutes. It'll be quick. It'll be easy. We've been talking we're talking for almost an hour now. But I think, hey, mission accomplished. The goal was to completely expose you guys as the resources that you are, and we did that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, and but before as we wrap up, what did we miss? If you want to take a second and just think about like anything that you'd like to. I know we just gave it a shout out to share data, share back and forth, reach out to IDEM, reach out to Caleb, but what other thoughts would you like to leave the listeners with, whether they're in the state of Indiana, whether they're not?
I'd leave with make sure. I think you said it best with trying to slay the dragon. Don't try to slay the dragon by yourself. Make sure the resources. I know it can be a double-edged sword, kind of with certain partnerships, and everybody's got their interests in place, especially with a regulatory side or for-profit, corporate, whatever. I understand everybody's got their own protections, but try to not be scared of those things. Take some. Right. Take some risks. It's fine to protect yourself on things, right? But, I think everybody, regardless of what position you're in, has, especially in the water sector, I think the water sector is such an amazing sector of people that truly do care about the mission at hand and truly care about water. Even if they're making a lot of money for whatever they're doing while doing it, they still very much talk, and root themselves in that they love water and that's a big important thing for people in general. So I just leave the final words of make sure we're collaborating, make sure we're sharing ideas and helping each other as much as possible, because water impacts everybody, and right. It's something that we'll always continue to need. So that the importance is there, the value is there, and wherever we're coming from, we need to make sure we're working together on that and not, like you said, don't slay the dragon by yourself.
Man, listen, and again, just to recap, I want to make it clear, and I hope we did today, that like for me, again, keeping it simple, the upside of amount of things that you all see, you specifically, IDEM as a whole, and the resources that you have, the data. I'm a data guy, right? The data that you have. The upside is way bigger to reach out and want to work with you than the downside that I share something with you and I get, hey, don't do that. I get that little slap on the hand. Don't do that anymore. Okay, cool. The upside is way bigger to me than whatever that people are afraid of. So don't be afraid. Reach out. Use the resources you have in hand. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know it took us a little bit to get this together. I really appreciate you being willing to do this. It goes right in hand with what you're saying about trying to build partnerships and putting a good word out there. So again, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
All right, that's the pod, everybody.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Stormwater World Podcast, and a big thank you to our sponsor, Bloxam & Company, home of the coconut fiber stormwater inlet filter that is super easy to install and maintain. Make sure you go check them out at Bloxam & Company. You can check them out at bloxam.com. That's BLOCKSOM.com. And we'll see you on the next episode.